Corporate funding for this program is provided by Amtrak. Amtrak, saluting 25 years of employee service. Major funding for this program is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency that supports research, education, and humanities programs, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights.
We just believed in Mr. Randolph. Nobody couldn't tell us, me especially, against Mr. A. Phillip.
Economic and
Nobody.
political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway. And just as
throughout the 20th century, A. Philip Randolph stood at the leading edge of social and political change. In the 1950s, he challenged union bosses, demanding equality for black workers.
But we do know that
A. Philip Randolph did more than anyone to set the agenda for the modern civil rights movement.
In the 40s, he faced down 2 presidents to end segregation in defense industries and in the military. In the 20s and 30s, he led black workers in a fight against a powerful corporation.
the very nature of the struggle on the part of labor and minorities.
And in 1919, the Attorney General called him the most dangerous Negro in America. A. Philip Randolph was born in 1889 in Crescent City, Florida. He was the second son of Elizabeth and the Reverend James Randolph, pastor of the Union Bethel Church. They christened him Asa, after a biblical king who distributed his wealth among the people of his kingdom.
Randolph grew up in a home that was headed by an itinerant preacher of the AME Church, whose most fiery member was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, a man who argued that there had to be total social equality and that black people had a right to demand it and violently if necessary. And so Randolph grew up with this kind of an expanding of his mind at a very young age.
I, as a matter of fact, never felt, and my brother never felt, we never felt that we were inferior to any white boy. And we were told constantly and continuously that you are as able, you are as competent, you have as much intellectuality as any individual, and you're not supposed to bow and take a back seat for anybody.
To supplement the Reverend's income, Mrs. Randolph took in sewing, and the family sold wood and meat. Their home was filled with ideas and debate on the best ways for black people to advance in America just 40 years after the end of slavery. As Randolph entered high school, most of Florida's black workers were limited to low-paying jobs on plantations or as domestics. They could not vote. They faced a constant threat of white violence. Randolph graduated valedictorian and vowed to go north. 4 years later, He was on a steamboat heading up the Atlantic coast, earning his fare as a kitchen hand. His destination was the Mecca of Black America at the turn of the century, Harlem, New York.
One of the wonderful things about being in Harlem during the period between 1900 and the First World War was the fantastic array of ideologies and ideas being debated. And if you were a young thinker like A. Philip Randolph and a person concerned with books and ideas, it was a kind of treasure trove and a kind of feast of activity.
The New York Randolph found in 1911 was a bustling place, filled with more opportunity and less fear than black people knew in the South. Randolph took a room in Harlem and dreamed of becoming an actor. But while attending City College, he was drawn to a different stage, the arena of radical politics. Randolph was captivated by socialism. Socialist Party spokesman Eugene V. Debs drew large crowds with talk of a classless society where the rich would not dominate the poor, but all Americans would be equal.
Debs was a great tribune. He was a visionary. He could inspire thousands and tens of thousands of people. He won almost 1 million votes when he ran for president in 1912. He was a great American Protestant in the best evangelical sense of that. And I think that that Randolph, whatever differences he may have had with Debs, had to have learned and to have, in a certain way, modeled himself on that experience, that kind of a leader.
The very nature of the struggle on the part of labor and minorities renders it inevitable that labor and minorities...
Randolph just kind of carved out a position as a kind of democratic socialist and participated in these debates and was active on the street corners virtually every evening and every afternoon in Harlem.
That labor and minorities can achieve freedom, equality, and justice.
In 1914, while selling radical political pamphlets, Randolph met Lucille Green, a successful Harlem businesswoman.
Lucille was a very elegant lady. I think she originally was a teacher at Howard University, came to New York, and successfully took up the hairdressing business and was a close associate of Madam C.J. Walker.
One of the great entrepreneurs of her time, Madam Walker was the first to create a line of hair and skin products specifically for black consumers. They were sold in elegant salons, like the one owned by Lucille Green. Randolph had no interest in joining Lucille at parties given by Harlem's wealthy elite, people he considered fly-by-night. Instead, he convinced her to join him at socialist rallies. In November of 1914, they were married, to the regret of Lucille's minister, at the elite St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Randolph's socialism made Harlem's upper class uneasy. Three years later, with money from Lucille's business, Randolph launched a political journal written with fellow socialist Chandler Owen. The Messenger became a loud voice in a growing movement, led by activists known as the New Negro Radicals.
but it became the most radical, and outspoken publication among black Americans during this period. It was openly socialist. It was pro-armed struggle. It launched drastic attacks on the black middle class and the developing black middle class. And it was extreme by any standards of black journalism at any period of time in history.
Among theories of black advancement, two dominated. W.E.B. Du Bois advocated a struggle for political and social equality. A founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Du Bois called for the black intellectual elite, a group he called the Talented Tenth, to lead their race. Booker T. Washington, a former slave, had pushed for blacks to be educated in the trades and other professions. He downplayed social activism, arguing instead for steady economic gain. One thing that Du Bois and Washington did have in common was the disdain of Randolph and the other new Negro radicals.
The various groups that had their own positions on how to solve the problems of African Americans surely became bitter rivals for the attention of the masses of blacks in the community.
Toward the end of the decade, a flamboyant new leader emerged, a Jamaican immigrant named Marcus Garvey.
Fellow citizens of Africa, I greet you in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. You may ask, what organization is that? It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one solid body the 400 million Negroes of the world.
In his own journal and in speeches, Garvey argued that former slaves should join a worldwide Return to Africa movement. Harlem's black community responded with enthusiasm. Competing black leaders did not.
Du Bois called Garvey, a man with big head and beady eyes. Garvey read Du Bois out of the race, saying he was therefore no longer a Negro. Du Bois was appalled at just the foolishness of it all. And Randolph thought it didn't have any class content and thought that Garvey was just a charlatan, and said that over and over and over again.
I told him that it was impossible for him to take Negroes from this country and carry them to Africa, to build an empire for black people in Africa. So in the first place, the people in Africa wouldn't permit you to come there to take over their land and so forth. Says they're black and you're black, but that doesn't mean that they agree for you to come over there and exploit them.
There were sharp differences of method between A. Philip Randolph's approach, the NAACP's approach, and Mr. Du Bois was probably the more outspoken in terms of his negative attitude about Garvey. But in retrospect, they were moving in the same direction. They were concerned about the black man and woman's status in the United States.
As the U.S. prepared to enter World War I, President Woodrow Wilson began rallying Americans, including blacks, to support the war. After 4 years in office, Wilson had done little on behalf of black Americans, even refusing to endorse legislation against lynching. Despite Wilson's record, Du Bois urged black Americans to support the war because of German hatred of all darker races.
There was turmoil in the black community because this was World War I, and Randolph was an opponent of blacks going into the military because he felt did not have a stake in the society.
Not only was he opposed to the war as a war, but he was opposed to American participation in that war. And in his and Chandler Owen's magazine, The Messenger, they took strong positions, condemned the government, condemned the war effort, condemned the NAACP and W.B. Du Bois for supporting the war. And they implied that those who were being loyal to the United States were traitors to their race.
In The Messenger, Randolph advised Du Bois to go to France if he was so eager to fight a war to make the world safe for democracy. Instead of fighting in Europe, Randolph wrote, he would rather make Georgia safe for the Negro. But some 400,000 black men did go to fight for the U.S. Still, Randolph persisted in his anti-war, anti-government stand, all the while attacking President Wilson as a racist on the home front.
During and immediately after the war, there was great panic in the United States, panic over the Bolshevist revolution in Russia, and the call for the internationalization of this revolution. There was the feeling that Randolph and Owen and others like them were dangerous, treacherous, and they should be watched.
A. Philip Randolph was considered by the Attorney General of the United States to be the most dangerous Negro in the United States.
In August 1918, Randolph and Chandler Owen were arrested at an anti-war demonstration in Cleveland. They were charged with treason. 2 days later, the judge dropped the charges but advised the pair to leave town. That November, Randolph was drafted. But days later, the war ended. Thousands of black soldiers returned home, and hopes were high that black patriotism would be repaid with racial equality.
You had deliberate efforts on the part of whites to be certain that blacks would go back into the same niches where they were before the war. Now, that kind of thing, the blacks having fought abroad to save the world for democracy, whites in the United States wanting to make certain that blacks did not presume to enjoy rights which they had not had before the war, you've got the makings of conflict.
In the red summer of 1919, there were more than 20 race riots across the nation. Randolph wrote in The Messenger, "New Negroes are determined that they shall not travel through the valley of death alone, but some of their oppressors shall be their companions."
The riot of 1919 was a bloody and horrible one, but it was different from previous race riots in the sense that African Americans were defending themselves. Before, whites had marauded through black neighborhoods, maiming and killing. Now, the African American community fought back, fought against its white oppressors and white vigilante activity. And that was a switch, a change, and it signified a shift in the consciousness of masses of African Americans that they were going to demand their rights in the 20th century.
To Randolph, the best way to achieve black rights was by creating opportunity and protection for black workers. He continued to use the messenger to push for unionization.
The labor movement in the United States of America is the most valuable single human institution in this nation so far as the working people are concerned. It is his rock in the wilderness. It is his salvation.
It was very hard for people to understand what Mr. Randolph was saying, though he was the most eloquent of speakers. And as he talked about the economic situation, about the importance of organizing and of unions, these seemed far removed to so many people.
Most of the unions, the trade unions at the time, had color bars in their constitutions, so that African Americans could only find union-type jobs when they would act as strikebreakers. And then the white union members would say, well, we can't have them in our unions because they act as strikebreakers.
Following slavery, why the National Labor Union perhaps admitted a few Negroes, but there was no sentiment for the organization of Negro workers. This was true in the old AFL.
The American Federation of Labor included more than 80% of the nation's labor unions. These individual unions, almost without exception, were closed to black workers. Samuel Gompers, head of the AFL, refused to intercede with local unions, or at times, their employers.
In the 19th century, the railroad companies were the biggest corporations in America. They were organized in a military fashion. From their view, workers were expected to obey orders and shut up.
A giant among the railway industry people was George Pullman and the Pullman Company. And what Pullman did was to get a monopoly on a unique kind of feature, which was the Pullman car. Which is in effect what he called a kind of home on wheels, or kind of palace on wheels. And Pullman made millions and millions of dollars off owning these cars and then leasing them to the railroads, and then providing black people as servants on these cars.
The Pullman car porter was a job created for freed slaves. The Pullman Company saw the ex-slaves as well-trained servants, experienced at attending to every whim of rich whites. By 1920, the Pullman Company was the largest employer of blacks in the nation.
When I started working for the Pullman Company, and this was classified as one of the best jobs, you didn't have any problems getting credit, and you always had a check coming, and they paid their bills and everything, and it was one of those things that it was a good job.
Honey, you sure is wonderful in them clothes.
Yeah, I suppose these clothes is something to look at.
In the film Emperor Jones, Paul Robeson played a Pullman porter, a worker who had some money and traveled the nation.
No people nice, Pullman porter. won't you shine my shoes? I got the Pullman Porter blues.
The porters wore caps with the sign on the front of them that said Porter. But people had come by custom to ignore the idea of calling them Porter and had come to calling all of the porters George. George was the first name of George Mortimer Pullman, the founder of the company, and this again demonstrates the pervasiveness of that band.
So they had no rights that the Pullman Company or any passenger, and in those days all the passengers were Caucasians, so the porters didn't have a single right that anyone had to respect, and of course they didn't.
In the early 20s, Pullman porters were earning about $15 per week for working more than 80 hours each week. Their meager wages were supplemented by tips. To get these tips, porters had to bow and offer a lot of yes ma'ams and yes sirs to white travelers. That led some to criticize them as Uncle Toms.
The porter played the role of Uncle Tom to an advantage that he made money out of it. You got a whole lot of people play the role of Uncle Tom and don't get nothing out of it. And the role that a whole lot of porters played, they played it to their advantage, and the white man paid for it.
Complaints over pay and working hours spread quickly down the rail lines. Some porters began to discuss creating a union to replace the weak, company-controlled union that currently represented them. Randolph kept the Messenger filled with talk of blacks joining the union movement. He wrote stinging critiques of white industrialists and continued to attack the black upper class for its support of capitalism. His writings brought him to the porters' attention. They asked him to create a genuine union to represent them.
The group that came and decided they wanted to organize a union determined, and I think with the streak of brilliance, that in order to organize the union, they needed somebody to lead it who was outside the reach of the Pullman Company. They found that man in a street corner orator and publicist named A. Philip Randolph.
On August 25, 1925, Randolph arranged a secret meeting with the porters at the Imperial Lodge of Elks on 129th Street in Harlem. 500 attended.
It was quite a meeting, because there was great fear among the porters, that stool pigeons would penetrate the meeting and carry news back to the superintendent, to who was there. And the superintendents were ruthless and would fire a porter if he had the slightest idea that he was trying to become a part of the union. And then I got up and told them, you have to take responsibility upon your own shoulders, building something upon which you can depend, that you get what you can take and keep what you can hold. You can't take anything without power, and you can't hold anything without power. And you can't get power unless you're organized. You could hear a pin fall, because it was looked upon as simply hopeless to try to organize a group of men who run the grip, the moral and intellectual and economic grip of a mighty corporation such as the Pullman Company was.
We meet today and freedom calls and raise our voices high. We'll join our hands in union strong to battle our true
The following day, more than 200 men poured into the messenger's office to join the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union.
We battle onward, victory will come.
Two months later, with a grant of $10,000 from a socialist group, Randolph began a nationwide union organizing tour that took him to Chicago, St. Louis, and Oakland. Chicago was home to more porters than any other city in the nation, and headquarters of the Pullman Company. Over the years, Milton Price Webster had tried to organize the porters, but was stopped by the powerful Pullman Company.
Mr. Webster told me that someone had recommended Mr. Randolph and told him about how he could speak and so forth. And he said, I don't know. I'd have to hear him. So when Mr. Randolph did speak, he heard him. And he looked and he said, well, he said, I think this is the guy that we ought to choose as our leader.
Randolph and Webster held meetings every night for 2 weeks.
Brothers and sisters, fellow workers, I'm very glad to have the opportunity to come out and have a talk with you about some of the problems in which we're all concerned.
Past efforts to form a porters' union in Chicago had led to harassment, beatings, and dismissal. The Pullman Company's reach was extensive.
The Pullman Company began to pull in its chits in the black community. It told black preachers, preach a sermon against these unions. It told the Chicago Defender that it's about time you start writing some editorials opposed to this union. So the Pullman Company used every influence it had possible against the porters.
Across the country, union activity cost hundreds of porters their jobs. Randolph was broke, at times passing a hat just to get train fare home. But by the end of 1926, there were Brotherhood locals in more than 20 cities, including Chicago.
So when I got home, before I got off train, the superintendent there told me, I understand you attend the meeting of the Brotherhood yesterday in St. Louis. I said, yes, I did. So we're going to tell you right now, we ain't going to have none of our porters attending the Brotherhood meeting. I said, well, if somebody told you I attended the meeting there, maybe they told you also that I joined yesterday. And before he could answer me, I said, and of course, before I joined, I thought about what lawyer I wanted to handle my case if you started messing with my job, man. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag anybody in the court and mess with my job. I didn't even know a lawyer name at that time. But I bluffed him out. It didn't bother me. And from then on, I was a strong supporter of A. Philip Randolph.
For nearly a decade, Randolph spoke to the nation through the messenger. But his criticism of Harlem's elite drained clients from Lucille's beauty shop, and in 1928, it closed. Without her financial support, the messenger also folded. Randolph, nearly 40, had lost one dream. He was determined not to lose another. He asked the American Federation of Labor to accept the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters into its membership. The AFL said no.
And so the Pullman porters were starting off fighting kind of two battles. They were trying to fight for the support of the white working class, the white organized trade union movement, while they were trying to take on the Pullman Company on the other hand. And it's an extremely difficult work and extremely kind of time-consuming. But it characterized the relationship of black workers and the labor movement. You always had to fight this dual fight. You know, you fight for the right to organize with white workers, and then you turn around and fight the corporations to get a fair share in a collective bargaining agreement.
Later that year, Randolph convinced AFL President William Green to grant the Brotherhood an independent affiliation. But the Pullman Company still refused to recognize the Brotherhood as the Porters' Union. Randolph realized that he had to apply more pressure.
We're at the point in the organization of the movement where we saw no immediate hope of getting any larger number of porters into the union. I called a strike.
All aboard, for we are coming. Union men, be strong. Side by side, we battle onward. Victory will come.
Pullman had begun to line up strike breakers from around the country and bring them in to hit its rail yards. Now, you don't have to have a whole lot of deep training to be a Pullman porter. I mean, you aren't as good the first day as the guys who've been there for 3 or 4 years, but they could be replaced.
Randolph failed to win the support of the other railroad unions, the AFL, or the federal mediators. He was forced to cancel the strike. Disappointed by the cancellation, half of the union members quit. Now, after a 3-year struggle, the very life of the Brotherhood was in question.
And Mr. Randolph talked to Webster and myself, and he said, we can save the Brotherhood, and we can find a way to win this fight. If we can keep the doors open in New York, Chicago, and Oakland, we'll survive. He said, now, I'm going to pledge you what I will do, and then I'll ask you fellas. So now let's join hands and pledge ourselves that we are going to save the Brotherhood, we are going to win this fight, or we'll report to our gods the reason why.
The Union was in this despair, and the Great Depression was about to come on. And when the Depression was coming, a man wanted more than anything a job. He wasn't concerned really about all these amenities. If you just have a job when that terrible time came.
After the Great Depression struck in 1929, half of all blacks were left unemployed. Porters were more reluctant than ever to risk their jobs for the Union. Membership dwindled to 700 nationwide. The Ladies' Auxiliary, an organization of porters' wives, raised money in a desperate attempt to hold the Union together.
If your husband's laid off for being an organizer, then somebody has to feed the family. So the women would kick in money, you know, in an insurance policy kind of way. And there are those legendary kind of stories of Randolph getting off a train with a hole in his shirt and one of the members of the Women's Auxiliary kind of running along behind him, trying to either put on a new shirt or sew the hole in the old one. So when Mr. Randolph stood up on the platform, he looked presentable.
In 1933, organized labor and the Brotherhood saw hope for the future in the new Democratic president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his promise of a New Deal.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct...
The idea of the New Deal was twofold. On the one hand, end the Depression by raising the wages of workers, creating purchasing power. Second, creating industrial democracy in industry, giving workers a voice so they could create a more democratic workplace and raise their wages. This together was a powerful movement.
In 1934, hundreds of labor strikes erupted across America. The National Guard was called out to halt violence in 16 states. To calm workers' anger with big business, Roosevelt signed several pieces of pro-labor legislation, giving workers the right to choose their own union. Now, after years of struggle, the porters had the right to choose the company union or the brotherhood. More than 7,000 porters voted. 3 out of 4 chose the brotherhood.
After the brotherhood had won the right to organize the porters, the Pullman Company found that they had been defeated. And to make themselves look good, they sent A. Philip Randolph a check, a signed check. And all he'd have to put the amount of money he wanted in the check, and on the bottom of it said not to exceed $1 million. But Randolph made a photostatic copy of that check and framed it, hung it on his wall, and sent the written check back to the Pullman Company and told them the Negro principal were not for sale.
So that this was a long period of some 12 years before we had the opportunity of walking into the office of the Pullman Company for the purpose of sitting around the board to negotiate a contract.
Never before had a black union forced a major American company to negotiate. One Brotherhood official recalled, "The Pullman Company could not conceive of Negroes sitting across the table talking to them as equals." The contract reduced the porters' work week from 80 to 60 hours and nearly doubled some porters' wages.
We'll join our hands in union strong to battle or to die.
When the Brotherhood won that agreement from the Pullman Company, I thought my heart would burst. I was so proud to be a member of a delegation going to march with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
The victory of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters meant a great deal, not only to the porters, but to the African American community in general. It gave them a sense of belonging. It gave them greater self-confidence. It gave them a feeling that perhaps if they continued to struggle, they could gain more, and that therefore they were encouraged to do so.
In 1940 and 41, the Roosevelt administration was gearing up for World War II, mobilizing the country, transforming the defense industries. There was a great deal of political conflict with isolationists on the right, with some elements of the American labor movement on the left. It was in this context, in the spring of 1941, that Randolph saw a moment of opportunity in which he could make a demand of the administration for the integration of the defense industries, for jobs for black Americans in the defense industries, and he would have the most leverage, the most power at that particular moment.
Randolph consulted with his close friend Milton Webster as they traveled by train to visit Brotherhood locals in the South.
Brother Randolph said to me, he says, "You know, Webb, we got to do something about these jobs around here." And of course, knowing Brother Randolph, I said, "Well, here comes something else." Well, he says, "I think we ought to get 10,000 Negroes and march down Pennsylvania Avenue and protest." What do you think about it? I said, "I think it's all right. Where are you going to get the 10,000 Negroes?" I said, "I believe we can get them."
When the
factory, trying to find some work to do. Had the nerve to tell me, black boy, nothing here for you.
Randolph used local Brotherhood offices to organize support for his march on Washington. Randolph demanded an end to segregation in the military. He called for defense industries and government to stop discriminating against black workers.
I shall never forget when there was so much excitement, so much interest on the part of the young people. They were enlisting people to go, they were having meetings, they were revving up their enthusiasm, and they felt that this was something really worthwhile.
He called mass meetings in polo grounds and Soldiers Field and other ballparks around the country. Leaflets were distributed in mass, tens of thousands. A. Philip Randolph will speak. He says, the Congress of the United States and the President must see 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 Negroes congregated on the lawn of the White House in protest. And the mass audiences rose to their feet because this was something new. This was not a leader who would go in behind closed doors and try to make a deal. Here was a man who demanded, with the people behind him.
Concern grew over the prospect of thousands of black Americans marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. President Roosevelt asked Randolph to come to the White House.
The president made as his first comment, he said, Phil Randolph, we can't have 100,000 Negroes marching on Washington. If anything such as that were to occur, you wouldn't be able to manage them. We might have bloodshed and death. He said, now, let us get on to business here and find out what can be done. So I said, well, Mr. President, what we're concerned about is jobs. Jobs in the munition industries, and we want to abolish discrimination against Negroes in the government, where there are many jobs. And he said, you're indicating that the government discriminates against Negroes? Look, I said, it's one of the worst offenders. We talked at length, and finally he said that, well, what do you want me to do? I said, we want you to issue an executive order abolishing discrimination in munition jobs and also in the government.
And Roosevelt could not take the chance that 25,000 people would be in Washington at a time when he was calling the United States the arsenal of democracy, which must keep Britain and France afloat as they carry the banner for freedom and liberty and justice and democracy. And then if 25,000 Negroes came to Washington, he would look like a fool.
He said, now, I'm going to have a committee set up here to study this question, but I want you to call off this march first. I said, that, Mr. President, I can't do. I said, as a matter of fact, the people wouldn't even follow me if I were to come out and call off the march, because they would consider that I had betrayed them. He said, will you march against the President of the United States? I said, we have no other alternative.
Randolph was the master of the strategic bluff, or the tactical bluff, if you will. Maybe he couldn't have marched on Washington. Maybe there wouldn't have been 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 people there. Indeed, Walter White of the NAACP said later that they couldn't have had anybody in Washington because it was not organized. Randolph was bluffing. But Roosevelt did not know that.
6 days before the march, the president signed Executive Order 8802. It called for an end to discrimination in the federal government and defense industries. And it created, for the duration of the war, a Fair Employment Practices Commission.
This was the real confrontation between the black and white in the White House. It demonstrated the ability of the black masses to win a victory themselves. And it gave them a new spirit, new hope, new determination, and a belief in themselves.
Randolph's decision to cancel the march drew fire from a new generation of radicals, including Bayard Rustin. They complained that Roosevelt's order did not address the segregation of black soldiers and offered no job protection in peacetime.
People were upset because it meant you had to rely on Roosevelt's word, and Roosevelt did not have that much credibility among African Americans about anything. He had not demonstrated any great commitment to civil rights. He had not demonstrated any commitment at all to equal employment opportunities, certainly. And a piece of paper with Roosevelt's name on it didn't mean a whole lot to a lot of black people. And it were those black Americans, Bayard Rustin one of them, who wanted to, in fact, have a march to make the point more forcibly, to, in fact, demonstrate black American political power so they could get, in fact, even more.
Randolph defended his action. After the signing of the executive order, 1 million black Americans were added to the industrial workforce.
As a result of this order, immediately and dramatically, people began to feel good about it. People began to get the kinds of jobs that they were more entitled to. It was noticeable to me in the way in which their attitudes changed about themselves and about others around them. They felt good about themselves. Mr. Randolph made one of the greatest social and economic impacts on our lives without having to overturn anything. Such a dramatic, such an immediate effect that we began to feel better, in fact, more loyal even to the country which had deprived us of so much for so long.
By mid-December 1941, the United States was at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Once again, black Americans were defending the U.S. in a global conflict. Once again, they faced discrimination and segregation that extended even into the military's blood banks.
We arrived back in the United States having served, but having been ourselves poorly served. When we came back, we were prepared to make a difference, to make a change.
Roosevelt's successor, President Harry Truman, called for universal military training, a peacetime draft. As in wartime, black soldiers would be segregated.
This was a period when universal military training was very controversial. It was a period when American politics were still in flux, moving from a kind of World War II period of alliance with the Soviets to one in which the Soviets would be an enemy. It was another one of those moments of opportunity that A. Philip Randolph was so good at grasping. And he used that period when the controversy was at its height about permanent peacetime draft to interject himself and his movement into the debate and demand the desegregation of the armed forces if black America was going to sort of sign on to American foreign policy.
Mr. Randolph said, in essence, if the Army is not integrated, he would ask all Negro soldiers, those to be inducted, to not serve in a segregated army.
A. Philip Randolph, in conjunction with a group of radical pacifists, began a movement to integrate the armed forces. That movement had lots of tracks to it. There were people lobbying in Washington, there were protests, and there was a radical wing which engaged in civil disobedience. Bayard Rustin was very involved in the radical wing of that movement.
On March 22, 1948, Randolph confronted Truman at a White House meeting.
The president was perfectly friendly until I told him that my recent visit to the West impressed me with the feeling that Negroes today were in no mood to shoulder a gun again, to fight for democracy abroad until they got democracy at home. Until I made that comment, the president was quite calm and judicial. But upon that statement, he was a little nettled and I think a bit irritated.
I had to decide what to do about the Negro talk that they would not serve in the armed forces. That was just pure treason. But the situation had to be met in some manner. Every American is obliged to serve the country when it's in danger.
On May 7th, Randolph and supporters marched in front of the White House. 2 months later, Randolph continued to pressure the president by picketing the Democratic National Convention. In a tight presidential race, Truman needed strong black support. Knowing that, Randolph turned up the pressure for an integrated military. Truman conceded and issued Executive Order 9981, calling for an end to discrimination in the armed forces.
This was a dramatic, historic, significant move toward ending racial discrimination in a very important sector of American society. It would be an example for the rest of the country, and it would be a kind of beacon light that would demonstrate the practicability of desegregation and even of integration.
Randolph believed he had won a great victory, but Bayard Rustin and other radical pacifists felt betrayed. They argued that Truman's executive order was a sham. It did not immediately end segregation in the military, and some pacifists remained in jails.
The master of the tactical bluff was being charged with doing no more than bluffing when he had threatened a strike against the Pullman Company. That strike was called off before it came about. When he had threatened a march on Washington in 1941, that march was called off when the executive order was issued by FDR. Now, when he had threatened civil disobedience campaign and the armed forces, against the armed forces for discrimination, that campaign was called off because of Truman's executive order. Rustin and Lynn and others criticized Randolph for never following through. They said he will bluff, but he will not act, and they wanted action.
And you began to get questions at that point as like maybe Randolph is out of touch. He doesn't understand the mood of this younger post-World War II generation. And it's not clear, you know, at the end of 1948, what Randolph's role is. He has no organization. The Porters are starting their long decline, and it's not clear what his future will be.
The American Federation of Labor's new president, George Meany, successor to the late William Greene. Once Greene's chief aide, Meany now heads the 8 million-member labor organization.
3 years later, in 1955, the AFL merged with the CIO to create the most powerful labor organization in America. George Meany became head of this new organization. A. Philip Randolph was elected to the Executive Council. The AFL-CIO Constitution now called for an end to discrimination. Randolph for strict enforcement.
One of the more frustrating aspects of Randolph's career was his long history of showing up to AFL conventions and taking to the floor to make speeches about racism in the trade union movement. What usually happened was the minute Randolph began to speak was that large numbers of the white workers would walk out to take a cigarette break or go get a drink, or they would turn their back on Randolph and just hold, loud and disruptive kind of conversations at their tables.
Randolph was the leader of a small union and one which was declining in strength. The leaders of the AFL-CIO felt they did not have to take him quite so seriously. After all, he didn't lead the big battalions. He didn't have the troops. That meant that Randolph had to make his impact felt with his voice and his moral authority.
Now, we don't charge that George Meany is anti-Negro. We don't contend that he does not want to see racial discrimination eliminated. But we do know that he does not possess the urgency, the sense of urgency, that action must be taken now in order that Negro workers may become fully free in the House of Labor.
Now 66 years old, and wanting to spend more time with his ailing wife, Lucille, Randolph repositions himself as elder statesman and advisor to the leaders of the emerging black protest movement. In Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, a black woman, Rosa Parks, was arrested for not moving to the back of a city bus. A Pullman porter, E.D. Nixon, began calling community leaders to gather support for a bus boycott.
The third person I called was Martin Luther King, and he said, "Brother Nixon, let me think about it a while and call me back." So I went on and called 18 people and called them back. And he said, "Yeah, Brother Nixon, I decided I'm going to go along with you." I said, "I'm glad you decided to go along with me, Reverend King." I said, "Your church is the only church right downtown. And I told 18 other people to meet at your church this evening at 3 o'clock, and it looked kind of bad to have that many people coming up to your church for a meeting of this kind, and you weren't there."
That night, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, with 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. at its head.
I called Mr. Randolph at his office, and I told him what had just happened, and I had been elected treasurer. I said, "It's my responsibility to raise some money." I said, "I need your help." He said, "All right." He said, "I'll pass the word around, and wherever you go, then somebody will know about it. So it won't be no problem you be getting able to talk to people." And he did that. And I was everywhere I got, I was received. And make a long story short, in 4 months' time, I raised $97,000 and bagged 5 automobiles. And I done it solely because of the influence of A. Philip Randolph, who knew his way around.
I'm so glad I'm fighting for my rights. I'm so glad I'm fighting for my rights. I'm so glad I'm fighting for my rights.
Through the winter, spring, and summer, Montgomery's black residents stayed off the buses. National attention was drawn to the boycott and its charismatic young leader.
For several weeks now, we, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, have been involved in a nonviolent protest against the injustices which we have experienced on the buses for a number of years. This is a nonviolent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces.
They stayed off the buses for nearly a year. Some walked miles to get to work or to church. Others formed complicated carpooling networks. That November, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on Montgomery's bus lines was illegal.
If I had never met Randolph, I'd have been probably like the average person in my city. Went along with whatever was happening because I wouldn't know no way to turn. And after I met Randolph, I learned how to deal with these problems. I represented his union, and if I'd done the thing wrong, he called me and wanted to know when I had a long layover, and I tell him, I need you in my office, I need to talk to you. And he'd sit down and talk to you like he was his son and explain these things to you. And because of that, if it had not been for Randolph, it wouldn't have been E.D. Nixon. If it hadn't been E.D. Nixon, you'd have never known Martin Luther King.
As gains were made in the national civil rights movement, Randolph pushed for an end to discrimination within the House of Labor. At the 1959 convention, Randolph and AFL-CIO head George Meany clashed over Meany's support of unions, black as well as white, that based membership on race.
Chairman.
Yeah. Brother Randolph.
This resolution is a declaration of a new policy. And it is a policy against racially segregated unions. It isn't logical to permit an organization to carry on a given type of behavior merely because the members want it. Therefore, we cannot conclude that because a group of Negro members in a union want a racially segregated union, that is proper and sound and in harmony with the Constitution and the spirit and the letter of the Constitution of the AFL-CIO.
Is this your idea of a democratic process, that you don't care what the Negro members think? You don't care if they want to maintain the union they've had for so many years? I'd like an answer to that.
Yes.
That's your policy? Well, that's not my policy. I'm for the democratic rights of the Negro members to maintain a union if they want it. Who the hell appointed you as the guardian of all the Negro members in America?
I would say this, Brother President, and I want to make it clear, and we don't have to become emotional about it, and that is this. I don't believe that the members of a union have the right to maintain a Jim Crow local. I don't believe that a group of Negro members of a union have a right to maintain a Jim Crow local if we believe in a democratic trade union policy.
George Meany was mad at Randolph for bringing up this issue of the segregated locals on the convention floor because he liked to run the AFL-CIO like a club. They would play gin rummy, they would go to the races, they would sit around, and they would work it out in the executive council. And of course, Meany had the last word. He didn't want Randolph or Walter Reuther mobilizing forces in the union movement or outside the union movement to put pressure on him.
In May 1960, young black union members formed the Negro American Labor Council to fight for black rights inside the AFL-CIO. They asked Randolph to serve as president. This alliance was strained when the younger activists pushed for action that would leave hundreds of workers without union protection.
We suggested that we start moving towards a demand for decertification of certain unions unless they comply with the issue of equity and fairness. Well, Mr. Randolph became riled, I think, two reasons. One, within his own union, he had never met such open opposition before, challenging his wisdom and his integrity. That, he gave the impression, was kind of an insult. But on the other hand, he made the point that we are in the House of Labor, that we are brothers and sisters in the House of Labor. And therefore, we couldn't take our battles outside of that house.
Meany saw the Negro American Labor Council as a direct assault, on his autonomy and an attempt to embarrass him publicly to make a move on an issue he did not want to confront his white workers on. And so his response, of course, was to call in Randolph behind closed doors and says, like, make up your mind. Are you going to be with me? Or are you going to be with them?
There were those within the NALC who began to ask, when they saw the resistance on the part of Mr. Randolph, began to ask the questions, why would he resist this when we came into existence on the basis of protest? And all we're doing is extending that protest. What are the things around it? It began to raise some questions in some of our minds about the independence in terms of thought and action that Mr. Randolph could or could not exert.
It's important to remember that Phil was a trade unionist through and through. He realized he was first and foremost, and always, of course, a firm voice for racial justice and for righting the wrongs that existed in society at large and within the trade union movement. But he never, ever believed that you could separate trade unionism from the pursuit of racial justice, that they were firmly and inextricably linked.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality, social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
For half a century, A. Philip Randolph had been fighting to improve the lives of black Americans. Once again, he saw a need for mass action and called for a new march on Washington for jobs and freedom.
After a year of Birmingham demonstrations, Medgar Evers being assassinated, it became clear to him that unless there was a march on Washington that summer, there might be riots all over the United States, but certainly all redress had to take place at the federal level. There had to be a civil rights bill, there had to be a voter rights bill, and he and Bayard conceived of the march and talked about how it should take place.
In April 1963, as Randolph began to plan the march, his wife Lucille died. They had been married for 48 years and had no children. But Randolph pushed ahead with the difficult task of uniting the civil rights organizations for the March on Washington.
Randolph was the only civil rights leader at that point who could in fact get all the rest of them to come into the same room. If Jim Farmer called Roy Wilkins might have another appointment, but neither Jim Farmer nor Roy Wilkins nor Whitney Young nor Dr. King would ignore a call from A. Philip Randolph. That was the first thing. They would definitely come to the meeting.
Randolph called together Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, James Farmer of CORE, Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Whitney Young of the Urban League, and John Lewis of SNCC.
Randolph said for some time, I have thought now, that it was necessary for Negroes to march on Washington. 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, he repeated, and phrases reminiscent of his 1941 calls, to march on Washington in protest against discrimination. Now that the civil rights revolution is well underway, I think this is a proper time for us to march.
Randolph's choice of Bayard Rustin as chief organizer threatened the fragile coalition. Some believed Rustin's homosexuality and radical past would be used to discredit the march. Knowing Rustin's brilliant organizing skills, Randolph stuck with his decision.
We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Randolph was again called to the White House, this time by President John F. Kennedy. 2 days earlier, the president had submitted civil rights legislation to Congress.
And I will never forget that Saturday morning as we walked into the White House following A. Philip Randolph. And we took a seat around the table with President Kennedy. And during the discussion, Mr. Randolph said to the president, "Mr. President," and he said it in his baritone voice, "Mr. President, the masses are restless, and we're going to march on Washington." And you can tell President Kennedy didn't like what he heard. He moved, he twisted in his chair, and he came back and said, "Mr. Randolph, if you bring all these people to Washington, won't there be violence and disorder?" And Mr. Randolph responded by saying, "Mr. President, this will be an orderly, peaceful, and nonviolent protest."
The climate, the day of the March on Washington, it's really hard to project the feeling. There was such fear and trepidation. When we drove up early that morning to the Capitol to meet with the congressional leadership, it looked like a deserted city. And I can recall when we got through with those meetings, I was in the limousine with Dr. King, and we could see people streaming down from Union Station as they were coming, and he shouted, "They're really coming, they're here."
Fearing violence, the AFL-CIO refused to endorse the march. But Randolph won financial support from the United Auto Workers and various religious groups. After a lifetime of calls for mass action, A. Philip Randolph gave the first speech at the March on Washington.
Fellow Americans, we are gathered here in the largest demonstration in the history of this nation. Let the nation and the world know the meaning of our numbers. We are not a pressure group. We are not an organization or a group of organizations. We are not a mob. We are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom.
Even as he spoke, the coalition Randolph had built was under strain. John Lewis was planning a speech that denounced Kennedy's civil rights bill and threatened that blacks would find their own ways to end discrimination.
And people really had some real problems with the use of the word revolution, the use of the word masses. And that's when A. Philip Randolph came to my rescue and said, "There's nothing wrong with the use of the word revolution. There's nothing wrong with the use of the word masses. I use it myself sometimes." But he did appeal to me in the name of unity, saying that we come this far together. Brother Lewis, let's stay together. Let's change it. And I couldn't say no to A. Philip Randolph. And I did change it for peace and for us to stay together.
More than 250,000 people waited with great anticipation for the last speaker.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation, a great, dedicated man. A philosopher of a non-violent system of behavior in seeking to bring about social change for the advancement of justice and freedom and human dignity. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
When he introduced King, it was poetic. And there were no dry eyes. Symbolically, it was like passing the torch from one generation of fighters to a new generation of fighters.
Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in Whitney Capital. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
A. Philip Randolph on the day of the March on Washington, this man was beside himself. He was so happy. He was so pleased. He was so gratified. And you can tell by his very being, his very presence. This was a dream come true. That's what he had been waiting for. You know, he's tried years before. He talked about a march on Washington, mass action. And he saw it there.
After the march, Randolph met with President Kennedy to push for passage of the Civil Rights Bill. A year later, President Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
He stands at the pinnacle of leadership, performing tasks that certainly no one else could do, not even Martin Luther King could do. Tasks that involved putting coalitions together, challenging the government, making demands, and standing firm until those demands were acceded to.
If he had been born in another period, maybe of another color, he probably would have been president. In another land, he probably would have been maybe prime minister, but head of state. But in a real sense, he was head of the building of a new nation, a better America.
In 1968, A. Philip Randolph retired from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the AFL-CIO. He lived alone in a small New York City apartment. In 1979, A. Philip Randolph died at the age of 90.
To learn more about A. Philip Randolph, visit us on the PBS homepage at the address on your screen.
Corporate funding for this program is provided by Amtrak. Amtrak, saluting 25 years of employee service. Major funding for this program is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency that supports research, education, and humanities programs, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.